336 BCE. A man steps out into the grand theatre he's just had built. He's expecting to be greeted by crowds full of adulation, but instead, one of his own bodyguards rushes forward, dagger in hand. The man in question was Philip II, and his assassination was one of the most significant turning points in ancient history. But who killed him? And was he the victim of a conspiracy involving his own son, a teenage boy who would soon become Alexander the Great? Philip's murder has got everything you want in a great story: sex, scandal, intrigue, drama. But when we scratch beneath the surface, his murder tells us a huge amount about sexuality in the ancient world, court politics in ancient Macedonia, and even the nature of conspiracy theories. So who killed Philip? Let's find out. In 336, Philip was at the absolute height of his power. Over the previous 20 years, he had transformed Macedonia from a provincial backwater into the most dominant power in Greece, and he was about to embark on the most important adventure yet, an invasion of the Persian Empire. As part of his preparation for this, Philip wanted to shore up the alliances he had with his neighbours, so he had arranged for his daughter Cleopatra to marry the ruler of a neighbouring kingdom called Epirus. He was a guy called Alexander. Ancient incest alert. Cleopatra's mother Olympias was Alexander's sister, so Cleopatra was marrying her uncle. Also, Alexander of Epirus is a different person to Cleopatra's brother, who was also called Alexander. Welcome to Macedonian history, everybody has the same name. Anyway, Philip wanted to use the wedding of his daughter to celebrate his achievements, so he had invited guests from all over the Greek world to attend, and he had put on this lavish ceremony in this brand new theatre that he'd just had built. Every seat in the theatre was filled, and Philip sent in a procession of statues representing the 12 Olympian gods. But there was a twist. The gods had a new companion, a 13th statue representing Philip himself. But Philip, of course, was no immortal, because as soon as he entered the theatre, one of his own bodyguards, a guy called Pausanias, rushed forwards and stabbed him to death. Pausanias made a run for it and rushed to the gates of the city where he'd left a horse. But just as he was about to make good on his escape, he fell over. As he was kind of clambering back to his feet, a crowd of soldiers who were chasing him caught up with him and shot him down in a hail of javelins. That, of course, means that Pausanias was never questioned, and that's where the conspiracy theories start. But before we get to those, what was Pausanias' motive? The most detailed explanation of this comes from an account written by Diodorus of Sicily. I'll put a reference to that in the notes for the video if you want to go and look it up yourself. Now, Diodorus was writing 300 years after these events happened. He also doesn't name the source. And of course, Pausanias was murdered, killed before he could actually be questioned. So there are reasons for perhaps doubting what Diodorus says, but this is the fullest account we've got. Let's look at what it says. He explains that Pausanias was one of Philip's bodyguards and also a very good-looking man. Those good looks caught the eye of the king, and over time, Philip and Pausanias began a sexual relationship. But eventually, Philip started to grow tired of Pausanias and his eyes started to wander. Right onto another bloke, also called Pausanias. Say what you like about Philip II, but he knew his type, men called Pausanias. And yes, this is another example in Macedonian history of everybody having the same name. So now Pausanias I was angry and jealous of Pausanias II. He goes up to him and he unleashes a vicious verbal attack. Essentially, he calls him a slag. Pausanias II was really upset by this. He felt insulted and ashamed, but he came up with a plan to win back his honour. He went to see a man called Attalus. Now, Attalus was a nobleman and the coming man at Philip's court because he was either the uncle or the guardian of Philip's new wife, Cleopatra. Now, this is a different Cleopatra to Philip's daughter Cleopatra, who was marrying Alexander, who wasn't the Alexander who was the son of Philip, who was killed by Pausanias, who wasn't the Pausanias who was going to see Attalus. Why do they all have the same name? Anyway, Pausanias II told Attalus all about what Pausanias I had said and explained that he couldn't live with the shame. A few days later, the Macedonians were fighting the Illyrians and Philip II himself came under attack. Pausanias II jumped in front of the king, took all of the blows that were aimed at Philip and was killed, but he died a hero's death. There was now lots of discussion about why Pausanias II had been so willing to lay down his own life and sacrifice himself. Attalus remembered what he had been told and set out to get vengeance for Pausanias II. And I should say that the next bit of the story does involve sexual violence. Attalus invited Pausanias I round for dinner, got him so drunk that he passed out, and essentially had him gang raped by members of his household, including enslaved people. Pausanias I was understandably furious and went straight to Philip II to complain. He demanded that Philip punish Attalus, but Philip refused. Attalus was so powerful now that he was essentially above the law. Not only was he such a close relation of Philip's wife, but he'd also been chosen as one of the generals who was going to lead an advance force into Asia Minor to prepare for the Macedonian invasion of the Persian Empire. We can see why Pausanias would be incredibly angry with Philip for this, for failing to protect him, for not giving him justice, and we can understand how that resentment might grow over time and lead him to murder Philip. That gives us a really clear personal motive for Pausanias' attack. But did he act alone? Now Plutarch, another one of our sources, says that when Pausanias killed Philip, most of the blame devolved upon Olympias. Olympias was Alexander's mother, another one of Philip's wives. Apparently she had emphasised that Pausanias was right to be angry and had encouraged him to seek vengeance. But Plutarch also suggests that Alexander himself was not entirely blameless. Apparently, Pausanias complained to Alexander about his treatment at the hands of Philip, and Alexander replied by quoting a line from the famous Euripides play Medea, which essentially suggested that Pausanias should kill Philip. Let's start with the obvious. This is anecdotal gossip written down hundreds of years after the events, and also Plutarch and men like him consistently characterise Olympias as being unnecessarily cruel, even when she was just doing things that men would do without criticism. And that's a reflection of the deep-seated misogyny and animosity that ancient authors had towards women in positions of power. But would Olympias and Alexander have had the motivation to want Philip dead? There are probably two big bits of context that matter here. First of all, Philip had married multiple wives. This wasn't particularly unusual for a king in the ancient world. But because Olympias was the mother of Alexander, who was well established as the heir to the throne, she was probably the most important woman at Philip's court. Now, Philip's first 6 wives, including Olympias, all came from places outside Macedonia. But in the early 330s, Philip had fallen in love with a Macedonian woman. That's the Cleopatra who was connected to Attalus, who we talked about earlier in the video. Now, a new, young Macedonian wife probably did risk upsetting Olympias' place in the hierarchy, and there is a chance that she felt like she was being sidelined. This was also true for Alexander. There are lots of stories from this period which suggest that the relationship between Alexander and Philip was deteriorating. For example, there's a story that at a banquet, Attalus called Alexander a bastard, suggesting that he had no legitimacy and would not inherit the throne. This led to a blazing row, and Alexander ended up leaving Macedonia. If Cleopatra gave birth to a son, there is a chance that he would have become Philip's preferred heir, and Alexander would have been pushed aside. That context reminds us just how turbulent and factional politics could be at the Macedonian court, and it gives us a clear reason why Olympias and Alexander might be worried about the future. But is there any hard evidence that they were involved in a conspiracy against Philip? This idea has probably been pushed most strongly by a scholar called Badian, and he gives 3 reasons why he thinks Olympias and Alexander were involved in Philip's death. First, he suggests that the incident with Pausanias and Philip and Attalus had happened several years earlier, so he wonders why it's only now that Pausanias acts, and he suspects somebody had encouraged him and used that as a trigger. But his main arguments concern what happened immediately after Philip had been killed. Antipater, one of Philip's leading generals and leading advisors, got Alexander and had Alexander acclaimed as king by the army. Badian thinks that this all happened so quickly that Antipater and Alexander must have been prepared for this, they must have known what was coming, and that means they were in on the conspiracy. Badian's next point concerns 2 brothers who were accused of complicity in Philip's murder and were executed. They were from a place called Lyncestus, which had a history of independence from the Macedonian crown, and so Badian thinks they might have been 2 people who could have challenged Alexander's authority. But crucially, they had another brother who was called Alexander. Of course he was called Alexander, there's another Alexander, another person in this story with the same name. Now, this Alexander was not punished, because apparently he was the first soldier to go to the side of Alexander the Great and acclaim him as king. The twist? He was Antipater's son-in-law. So again, Badian says that these men must have all been prepared for what was going to happen. I think there are problems with this interpretation. First of all, the brothers from Lyncestus weren't the only people that Alexander had killed when he came to power. I think this is just a reflection of court politics, of factionalism, of different potential candidates for the throne, and we see lots of examples of this in Macedonian history. I think accusing the brothers from Lyncestus of complicity in the death of Philip was just a good justification for getting rid of them, which was something Alexander wanted to do. More importantly, what else was Antipater supposed to do after Philip had been murdered? The king is dead. Long live the king. You can't leave a power vacuum festering at the heart of a monarchy because you get competing candidates for the throne. That's when you get civil war. That's when you get long-term turmoil. The army who played a role in acknowledging or acclaiming a new king was already assembled, so why wait? You had ambassadors from all over the Greek world who could confirm that they acknowledged Alexander as the new king of Macedonia. There was nothing to gain by waiting and everything to lose. So I think Antipater is just doing what anybody in his position would do. And yes, there might have been a little bit of self-interest motivating him. By being the person who had Alexander acclaimed, he demonstrated his loyalty, his support for Alexander. That was a way of making sure that he would retain his influence at Alexander's new court, which wasn't necessarily guaranteed. But honestly, I just don't think that any of this needs to be premeditated. This is just something that a man in Antipater's position would do. After all, Alexander was the established heir. What other option was there? And that's the biggest thing for me. Alexander was firmly established as Philip's heir. He had acted as a governor for Philip while Philip had been away on campaign. He had had an important military command in the Macedonian army at the pivotal Battle of Chaeronea just a couple of years earlier. Philip's marriage to Cleopatra may have threatened Alexander in the long term, but there was no need for him to act now. The marriage would only be a threat if Philip and Cleopatra had a son, which certainly wasn't guaranteed. And infant mortality was so high in the ancient world that even if they did have a son, there was no guarantee that that would survive infancy. If it did, well, Philip was a warrior king. He was constantly leading from the front line in battles. He walked with a limp in one leg from a war wound. He'd lost an eye in a siege. There was every chance that Philip could be killed in battle at short notice, unexpectedly, particularly if he went ahead with the invasion of Persia. If that happened, if Philip died unexpectedly, there is no way that an infant would have been chosen to succeed Philip over Alexander. So there's just no need, I think, for Alexander to get involved in a conspiracy now. In 10, 15 years' time, maybe, but not in 336 BCE. The risk to Alexander of getting involved in a conspiracy against his own father now seems to me to massively outweigh the risk of waiting. And there's one piece of evidence that I've been holding back that I think should shut down these conspiracy theories. Diodorus and Plutarch were both writing hundreds of years after these events, when there had been plenty of time for contradictory reports to have emerged or to have been invented, and we don't know who their sources were. But there is one author who was much closer to the Macedonian court: Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the most famous philosophers from ancient Greece, but crucially, he had for a little while been the tutor of Alexander, and that meant he had good connections to the Macedonian court. He knew the people involved in this, and he will have known what happened. In his famous work Politics, Aristotle says that the attack on Philip by Pausanias was because he allowed him to be insulted by Attalus and his friends. So he puts Philip's murder down to a lone attacker motivated by a personal grudge. Now you might say, Aristotle taught Alexander he would want to protect Alexander's reputation, and if he was writing a work about Alexander or about the Macedonian court more generally, then that is something I would consider seriously. But the Politics is a study of how society operates. He talks about Philip and Pausanias in the context of talking about risings against individual leaders, and he stresses just how powerful a motivation revenge can be. He gives a long list of assassinations that have been carried out as an act of revenge. If he was not 100% sure that Pausanias had acted alone and had acted because of his anger with Philip, then Aristotle would not have included him in this list. There was no need. If everybody at the time thought Alexander and Olympias had been involved in this conspiracy, then talking about Philip and Pausanias in this context would have completely undermined Aristotle's point. So I think this tells us that when Aristotle was writing, a few years after this event took place, people in the ancient world thought that Pausanias had acted alone when he murdered Philip. Of course, there were later conspiracies involving Alexander the Great, And after his death, Olympias played a key role in the fight to succeed him, and that certainly involved lots of scheming and plotting. All of this might have affected how later authors thought about Philip's assassination, but when we look at that event in isolation, I just don't think that there is enough evidence to say that Olympias or Alexander were involved in Philip's murder. The one thing this episode does reveal for certain is that it shows it was widely accepted that the Macedonian king could and would have sexual relationships with another man. Now that might have a really important bearing on how we think about Alexander the Great's own relationships, but that's for another video. If you've enjoyed this, please give the video a like and hit subscribe for more deep dives into ancient history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.